think of when you imagine the worlds of ancient Greece and Rome? Perhaps you imagine one of the gods of their respective pantheons, or maybe you go the more historical route and see figures such as Julius Caesar, Socrates, Alexander the Great, or Cleopatra. Now, the second question I'd like to ask you is, what do they look like? There's a strong chance that the picture in your brain when these figures come to mind is of some depiction that you've seen of them, of Colin Farrell or Elizabeth Taylor in flowing robes and tunics, or maybe a neoclassical statue of Plato pondering life, or an epic Renaissance-era painting of the gods if you enjoy art history. These depictions all have one correlating factor. All of them portray these figures as distinctly European. Ever since Western Europe was reintroduced to the classical world of antiquity, there has been a desire to paint the characters and figures of the ancient world less as they actually appeared in reality and more like the audiences who would receive them. This isn't entirely malicious in theory. After all, Greek writers were not particularly descriptive in their writing, at least in regards to their characters' appearances, which leaves plenty of room for interpretation, and it seems natural to want to find ways to relate to these larger-than-life figures. What better way to do so than by making them look like the people who would view their work? The issue arises when such depictions become the only exposure to Greco-Roman culture most people have, which would likely be the case for the mass majority of audiences. Let's dive into this problem by looking at one of the most pervasive figures in media, a woman whose story is so rarely told with the full nuance that should befit a historical figure as a result of the literal and figurative whitewashing of history that surrounds her. Grab some kohl eyeliner and your best smuggling rug, because we're rolling right into Cleopatra, particularly the way that she's been represented in popular culture and how that portrayal has influenced how people viewed all of the ancient world. Let's begin in the Renaissance, when antiquity reacquainted itself with Western Europe and artists and creatives were diving headfirst into creating their own visions of the classical world. When people in the 16th century saw Giampitrino's painting Death of Cleopatra, that depiction of her, with her milk-white skin, red hair, pale eyes, was one of the few that existed of the queen. So it's likely that it was the reference point that they looked back on when thinking about her again. She's portrayed similarly in another piece depicting her death about 100 years later, in Guido Cagnasi's The Death of Cleopatra. Side note, but how telling is it that the male artists that we're discussing are more keen to paint her death than any part of her role as queen? Really shows what they wanted to emphasize in regards to women in power. But to return back to the art, Cagnasi's Cleopatra shares not just the same scene, but the same coloring as Giampitrino's, a pattern that continues in numerous pieces of art. It is clear that this idea of Cleopatra's appearance is one that captivated audiences and artists alike, even as the Renaissance period moved into newer movements of art history. Never mind that, although we can't say for certain what the real Cleopatra would have looked like, she most likely would not resemble the Anglo-Saxon women of Giampitrino or Cagnasi. These portrayals were still the model for how Europe decided Cleopatra and the world around her looked. As Western Europe became more attached to this idea of the ancient world looking like them, they began seeing themselves as the inheritors of their ideas in society. And in an increasingly racist world, there would be no place to imagine Cleopatra or her fellow figures of antiquity as anything other than very, very white. Before we continue, it should be noted that, for all intents and purposes, Cleopatra was probably not the exceptionally beautiful woman these artists were thinking about when they painted her. Few contemporary records of her appearance exist, and when Plutarch wrote of her a century after her death, he simply stated, "Her beauty, as we are told, was in itself not altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her." What we do know of her appearance survives on coins minted during her rule. They show a woman with an aquiline nose and a strong brow, a far cry from the woman in the Cagnasi portrait. Though these surviving images are by no means unattractive, during her life, Cleopatra's appearance was secondary to her charm and intelligence. Her characterization as a conniving seductress would begin in earnest during the reign of Augustus, who fought against her and Mark Antony when he was still known as Octavian. An example of anti-Cleopatra propaganda in the age of Augustus comes from Perpetuate in his Elegies, where he refers to Cleopatra as the harlot queen of licentious Canopus, the one disgrace branded on Philip's line. It is this characterization of harlot, whore, seductress that survives and has shaped nearly every depiction of the queen in pop culture, most famously by Shakespeare, who wrote of her in his play Antony and Cleopatra. "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale. Her infinite variety other women cloy. The appetites they feed, but she makes hungry, where most she satisfies." The erasure of the complicated, three-dimensional reality of Cleopatra's personhood in favor of portraying her only in relation to the men in her life meant that Cleopatra was now firmly established as a sexual figure. Since, in the eyes of the misogynistic societies in which she was discussed, a woman could only be desirable as a result of pure physical attractiveness, the focus of Cleopatra-based media was now on her looks. By the time Hollywood rose to prominence in the early 20th century, this whitewash of Cleopatra was already a long-standing tradition in theater and art, once again, particularly as a result of her characterization by Shakespeare. She was a popular character in media already, so it is not a surprise that there was a desire to see Cleopatra films made since practically the inception of film, with the first film about her, robbing Cleopatra's tomb, being created in 1899. Fun fact, this is one of the first horror films ever made. Take time to thank Robbing Cleopatra's Tomb today for being a part of the reason why the Brendan Fraser remake of The Mummy exists. Though Robbing Cleopatra's Tomb, admittedly, had little to do with the whitewashing of her appearance, it did pave the way for more dramatic films starring the Queen to be put into production. In 16 years, from 1908 to 1917, 4 separate movies about Cleopatra's life and love affairs popped up in theaters. It is little surprise that this influx in Cleopatra media was occurring at such a high speed, as the early 20th century also saw a boom in Egyptomania as a result of the excavation of King Tut's tomb. Egypt was the vogue of the day, so it is no surprise that producers wanted to capitalize on this craze as best they could. Cleopatra became exotic again. Here was a symbol of the mysterious East, a seductress donned in ornate jewelry and doused in intoxicating perfumes. Casting directors seized upon the opportunity to cast Hollywood's elite it girls, sex symbols of the era who could dance the line between the erotic fetishization of Cleopatra's foreignness from her lovers, while also adhering to a rigidly white European beauty standard. Theda Bara set the tone for the Cleopatras who came after her in 1917, with a sultry and gothic performance that entranced audiences but largely did not survive as a result of morality codes at the time. The women who followed her, Vivien Leigh, Claudette Colbert, and of course Elizabeth Taylor, whose performance is so ubiquitous with Cleopatra that her portrayal is the basis on which most people remember the Queen, all had the same dark hair and pale white skin of Bara, and all played up her sensuality and sex appeal. Their appearances and acting choices would forever shape how people viewed Cleopatra and who should get to play her. "How would you like to be the wickedest woman in history?" director Cecile B. DeMille supposedly asked Colbert in 1934. That was the general view of Cleopatra in Hollywood, and little has been done to change that perception in popular media in the decades following. In recent years, there has been pushback over the whiteness Cleopatra has been ascribed. There seems to be 2 camps. One looks at the lack of evidence that we have about Cleopatra's mother to suggest that she may have had Egyptian or Nubian ancestry, while the other points to her family's history of inbreeding as evidence that she was likely full-blooded Macedonian. Though neither side is inherently wrong in terms of the evidence they bring up, there is a problem with framing this issue around her supposed whiteness. Namely, Cleopatra would not have considered herself to be any of the races modern people have attempted to assign to her in the first place. Unfortunately, arguing that point does not solve the issue at hand, which is that the whitewashed depictions of Cleopatra in the media have led to a misconception that she can be definitively ascribed to one race or another. By consistently painting portraits and creating films that show a European white woman in the place of Cleopatra, the media has connected ancient Greece with European whiteness. This in itself is a falsehood. Even if Cleopatra was a fully inbred Macedonian Greek, that does not prove that she would have looked white in the sense that we think of the word now. The reality of the situation is that whiteness is a relatively recent concept, and not one that can be assigned to figures who lived so far before its conception in good faith. To pretend as though Hollywood or popular culture in general does not have an incredible ability to influence people's understanding of the world and history is to deny the ways in which artistic depictions of Cleopatra have influenced the way in which we see her and her culture. Cleopatra is just one large example of a greater phenomenon of how the visual media we consume enables the whitewashing of history, as the arguments surrounding her supposed racial background imply a racial categorization that simply did not exist in her time. Perhaps now we can look upon the art and film that influences us every day, and understand the ways in which it paints our own conception of history, and use a critical lens to think about the implication that those conceptions may have had on our understanding of the realities of antiquity. Likewise, it is time for us to recognize that Cleopatra herself has been done a major disservice in the media. Very few portrayals of her have managed to capture the rich intellect and capable leadership which defined her in her lifetime. Perhaps, as we open our eyes to the fact that our whitewashed depiction of Cleopatra has validated and continued a weak and one-dimensional portrayal of her life, we can recognize her reality, that she was adaptable above all else. In Cleopatra's life, she knew the importance of perception, and made many attempts to tie herself both to Greek and Egyptian culture, presenting herself as more aligned with one or the other depending on the situation. Knowing that information, I think Cleopatra herself would understand the desire of many women of color to see themselves in her. By casting a different Cleopatra, one who doesn't adhere to the European beauty standards that have been so closely tied to her seductive characterization, Future Cleopatra-based media might be able to push away from the whitewashed character past media has made her out to be, and the world may finally be able to come closer to seeing a genuine depiction of the woman who has dominated so much of history.